So this wonderful Blu-ray set, sorry, Steve Hackett, Foxtrot at 50 and Hackett Highlights, there it is out tomorrow, I believe. I will put a purchasing link just below this video. First question, Steve, is I want to talk about the
Yes,
lighting for this tour. I saw the Cambridge show, and of course it's
yes,
captured beautifully on here.
yeah,
Lovely blues and I think reds and things like that during the Foxtrot section, perhaps reminiscent
yeah,
of the album cover.
yeah.
How much input do you have into the actual lighting design?
Well, we used to, back in the old days, we used to have production rehearsals, and I would get, as involved in it as any lighting designer would let me. Obviously, there's time involved with that. These days, it tends to be a much more general thing. I think it's just because life gets busier and there's more and more commitments. And I find myself wearing a number of hats. So um, I don't have quite as much time to devote to that as as usual. But then, there'll be certain things like when we were in Japan, we saw these Shinto gateways, and we thought that might be interesting for this because the Japanese have this whole association with foxes. They consider them to be spiritual beings that are sort of a link between earth and heaven in their philosophy or religion. And uh, there was also this very lovely thing of sort of drifting leaves while we were there. So we thought perhaps it could be a sort of central gateway to it. I think I would have made more of it if there'd been more time and perhaps more money. But at the end of the day, one invests um, the show with everything you possibly can, emotionally and financially and all the rest.
Yeah, it was a
But it
beautiful
is an
show.
it is an important part. It is an important part of things. Production values are very, very important. It was very important to the initial selling of this album when it was 50 years young, 50 years plus ago.
Hmm.
I think that made the difference to Genesis fortunes back in the day, because we'd often play the same songs to audiences, but without any sort of visual references. People were just baffled by it. It wasn't until we embraced theatre in those days that it made the difference to the band's fortunes. And now, of course, these songs are very, very well known, so people can sing along with every note if they want, as they often do in certain parts of the world.
Yeah,
Um,
but yeah,
it's,
it was a wonderful show. I mean, I'm talking of shows and extravaganzas. Of course, next year marks the 50th anniversary of The Lamb, I believe.
that's right. Yes,
I'm just
yes,
wondering
yeah,
if there was anything special in the bag planned for that.
yeah. I'm not intending to do the entire album because it's a double album for all sorts of reasons. I think um, I'll be cherry picking across um, favorite Genesis things, but I will do some Lamb highlights. Basically, that's how I see it. A selection of things that I think work best as standalone songs within um, the great wall that is Lamb Lies Down on Broadway.
Yeah, yeah. So you kind of let the cat out of the bag there. You think there will be like
I suppose I have, yes, yeah.
well,
But at some point next year, I'll be doing that. I realise there's no British tour this year, but next year there will be. So there'll be that. There'll be some surprises. Still working it out. I'm still taking Foxtrot to America. I'm about to
right.
take that show. They haven't seen that yet, so COVID catch up, and so dates have to be a little bit flexible as regards centenaries. 1972 transplant to 2022.
Uh-huh.
We're still on catch up for so much stuff. So it's very hard to say yes. Okay, in 1974 we did this, and therefore 50 years later we will be doing X Y Z. It's not quite like that. It's a more complicated equation, really.
Yeah, yeah. One thing I was listening to the watching that Blu-ray last night. Lines
Yep.
like Winston Churchill dressed in drag used to be a British flag plastic bag. I mean, how much was it of an influence was Edward Lear to these early Genesis stuff?
Well, Pete did the lyrics for Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. Sorry, Supper's Ready, Freudian slip.
Yeah.
He insisted on writing all the words for that. nobody stopped him. So I don't know whether his influences came from. To be honest, we were all readers. We all liked to read books. We liked. I seem to remember Gorman Gast was doing the rounds and all this sort of stuff. But I don't know what Pete was thinking about at the time. As regards the song, I just liked the fact that it was obviously tremendously Beatlesque, and it had that cartoon quality that I think some of the Sergeant Pepper stuff did, and I Am the Walrus. It had those moments of, oh, surprise, what's coming next? Sound effects, sped up voices, slowed down voices, but very speed aspects. So I think my approach to it was more general, and I thought Pete was tremendous doing that.
Yeah.
So very, very imaginative. By turns controversial, and then there would be social comment on the same album, and then the influence of early music and the influence of science fiction, and all sorts of things, and hardly a love song in sight, of course.
Absolutely. I mean, talk about the music, but Genesis has always contained a kind of a melancholy and romance of the music. And do you think this accounts for the band's popularity in Europe, perhaps in the early days?
I think so. Perhaps we were drawing from operatic tradition without really realizing it, and that might be the reason why the Italians embraced it. There was a hint of religion in there, implied within the band's name and Supper's Ready, and obviously allusions to the Last Supper and all of that sort of stuff. But I think the wide range of influences played its part as well. I think perhaps the music was a little bit concerto-like.
Mm-hmm. Quite churchy as well.
Sorry, quite churchy.
Yes.
Yes, I agree. All of that.
A hymnal, pastoral music. I think it's very.
Yeah, all of that. Pastoral, English, but not exclusively so. I think at times Russian. A hint of Shostakovich, a bit of this, bit of that, bit of Vaughan Williams. Tony was, I believe his mother was some kind of classical pianist. Whether she did that professionally or not, I don't know, but I think it was. That was implied. So we had conversations about that sort of stuff. I liked classical music very much. So I was listening to William Byrd and Bach and various things, and the Romantics, and I still do. If you're thinking about anything orchestral, you're going to go back probably to the 19th century and say, oh, how were they arranging their strings? What did they do with woodwind? How did this work? How was that, and the effect on film music, of course, and on the Genesis stuff. I think in spirit was very classical, but in practice, of course, there we were, a rock band with a few hands on deck.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Obviously, the classical influences in your music and specifically your playing, those Baroque influences are apparent. But I'm just wondering, how did the British blues movement in the 60s shape you as a musician? I mean, there was an interesting interview with Graham Edge of the Moody Blues. He said he felt somewhat inauthentic coming from Birmingham and playing American blues. Do you think he has a point?
I've never worried about that, about whether the whites can play the blues or not. I know that this divides people, and some feel that there was a rip-off that went on another level. Talking to an American journalist yesterday, he was saying it's interesting that England managed to serve as a kind of mirror and reflect back to America the things that they had in their own backyard.
Mm-hmm.
To make America aware, perhaps second time, of what an incredibly rich tradition they had that spoke to English musicians,
Mm-hmm.
and perhaps had bypassed most of mainstream America, and that was to change with the well-known acts who still base themselves on blues. But I loved blues. I remember growing up thinking, oh, this is great. one of the first things I heard was, I'd been playing harmonica for about 10 years before guitar was my main instrument. And then hearing the Stones doing something with harmonica, I thought, I can do that. And all the sonic developments that happened within electric guitar playing seemed to happen in blues, first of all. Sustain, vibrato, distortion, a kind of early form of synthesizer called the guitar.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely fascinating. I mean, it's um, interesting. Talking about progression from that British blues movement. Interesting book by Rob Chapman in his study of Syd Barrett and British psychedelia. He states that Interstellar Overdrive was the zeitgeist moment in the development of English pop music, as it liberated pop from its blues roots. What exactly
Yes.
do you agree with that?
Well, let's put it this way. I think um, music was about to change. Obviously, blues has more to do with spirit than form. There's minimal form and maximum spirit. You get an emotional player who can pull it off, and it's very moving. It's very exciting. It's wonderful. But just in terms of my own personal experience, I wanted desperately to be a blues guitarist, harmonica player when I was starting out, and uh, I don't think I was that great at it. So if fortunes had changed and the Stones had given me a call, I probably would have been doing something else for a living by now. But music was on the change. It was about to become inclusive. I think the blues boom died on a number of artists who were or wannabes who desperately wanted to be Muddy Waters, but they were the wrong age, the wrong color, in the wrong country. Um, but as music changed and became more inclusive, permissive, inclusive,
Mhm.
progressive, whatever adjective you want to use with this, it seems that there was a chance of embracing what had been, and hopefully without any prejudice, be able to take on board so many other things as well, including what we have to call world music at this point, but it's all regional music, it's folk music from various places with different instruments. So it sounds exotic to us, but I suspect if you grew up in Azerbaijan, you would be very familiar with the tar and the dutar and the oud and various other things, and you'd just be thinking of it as the local equivalent of Max Bygraves. But for us, it's very different. So of course, the sitar arrived courtesy of George Harrison and the Beatles. Music was on the change at that point. I mean, they had the world's ear. That was a wonderful thing. So anything they did, it immediately became mainstream. So East and West suddenly were fused into something acceptable. Lots of people started going off to watch whole sitar concerts and would have been completely unfamiliar with it. But suddenly, yes, the zeitgeist, the fashions had changed. I think that most bands couldn't afford the level of manpower that the Beatles had. So they were, yes, if they snapped their fingers, they could have the LSO there, in the blink of an eye. I think for the rest of us who were just desperately saving up to get our first guitars and amps and all the rest, and to get a little band together, we had to set the bar, our sights a little bit lower.
Uh,
And but by the time we were in a position to do something about it, of course, all these other lovely things were possible. Time signatures, syncopation, the influence of the English hymnal, as you've mentioned, all of that, church music, and so Genesis, it seems to me, it was the combination of syncopation and church. These two very separate schools of thought were to come together into the opening track, which is "Water of the Skies"
mm.
on Foxtrot. You've got the sort of collision of separate worlds of thought.
I mean, it's fascinating. 1967, we've certainly besides the release of Sergeant Pepper, it's all those former R&B bands suddenly
Yes.
start singing about toy shops and tea parties, and it was just wonderful. But I'm reminded of a quote. Richard Thompson, in his biography Bees Wing,
Mm.
said Syd Barrett wasn't a great musician in the traditional sense, but he was aware of the possibilities of music. I wondered to what extent would you agree with him?
Well, I think so. I think that, there's an outside brain coming in, isn't it? It's thinking outside the box. Um, he was obviously bright, but perhaps he wasn't shackled to the idea of um, technique at the expense of imagination. I think that links to the Beatles. And recent conversations had with Nick Mason,
Mm-hmm.
he was saying, that we were there at the Abbey Road, and obviously we end up talking about the Beatles. But he says, that yes, and we were there recording our stuff at the same time the Beatles were in the famous studio doing their thing. So rubbing cheek by jowl. So
Yeah.
it's all part of a British movement. And I do think he was very, very clever. And I do think that they were very imaginative. And I think there's a little less somnambulance about the music, perhaps, and less sort of disaffected aspect, and more weird and wonderful going on. I don't have a problem with that, but I think that a band like Floyd went through a sea change
They did, yeah.
as personnel varied, etc. Much the same as Genesis went through a sea change, from roots, theirs in psychedelia, I think ours in progressive, or what we latterly think of as progressive, although we didn't know it at the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to go back to the Lamb. You said the Lamb was influenced, in your book, Genesis in My Bed. Lamb was influenced by the bleak, melancholic atmosphere of the Grange. Did you experience any strange ghostly goings on while you were there?
Well, we'll never know what were the ghosts and what were the geese, really. The thing is, there was I had a room at the top of the house, and the scratching noises that went on in the night, I just assumed them to be rats in the air ducts. But it may well be that there was something more sinister going on. I know Jimmy Page says he saw something at the top of the stairs. I think he was sharing the same room. I was using that room later on, and it was it was very, very difficult to sleep. And
Yeah.
the other thing is that I remember going into a bathroom right at the end of recording there, and I just stepped back from the sink, and and I was standing in the door frame. The whole of the floor had given away. I mean, obviously the floorboards were rotten. Whether there was any malevolent presence there that was out to kill me, I don't know. But it was certainly, it had its challenges. That place.
Yeah.
It was not in great. It wasn't in great shape. So I didn't see any apparitions,
Mhm.
but I remember it being the most challenged time for Genesis, losing our lead singer. We knew we were going to lose Pete. He
Mhm.
was in the band, he was out of the band, he was in the band again. He was only going to stay to the end of all the gigs that were going to support Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. And, you know, I think that it's a miracle that the album got made in any sense at all, let alone became a double album and was toured relentlessly for about 9 months without a break. I think we had 3 weeks off at Christmas. Okay, fair enough. But other than that, we were flat out, and anyone who saw us on that tour towards the end of we had coughs that wouldn't go away. We were green. We looked pretty much the same as David Bowie's band, who we met at Victoria Station just as they were heading out on whatever they were doing, working very, very hard. And I thought, these young guys, why are they looking so green? Most people would say, pale and interesting, but you could see that there was just so much, relentless touring and late nights and all the damage that goes on with. And you hope young guys are going to be able to weather it. Syd Barrett, no doubt, had his pressures
Mhm.
with
Mhm.
all of that too. It's very easy to say, oh, well, drugs played their part. But I think everyone's got to do whatever they can to get through to the other side of the circus. And it can be very dark times indeed.
Yeah, I mean, Spectral Mornings. I mean, that was there's certainly a theme on that deals with the survival of the spirit after death. But in your
Yeah.
book, interesting, you mentioned that Scotty, Chris Squire's wife,
Yeah.
told you that Chris was trying to get in touch with you. Why do you think that might be? You don't know him a fiver or something, do you?
I don't know him a fiver. No, no. It's a very strange thing. Um, I do believe in survival after death. I'm
Yeah.
not alone with this. I'm not religious. I don't. There's no dogma as far as I'm concerned. But um, as regards Chris, very interesting working with him for a start.
Yeah.
Uh, very different to working with Genesis. Genesis is much more stiff upper lip. Um, Chris was very much more emotional. His wife said, when Chris likes something, he'll be listening to it and he'll burst into tears. That's just the way he is.
Yeah.
So I enjoyed working with him very much. I mean, Chris was a one-man roller coaster. There's no doubt about it. He was a man of his passions and was extraordinary. It's probably a bit like working with the James Robertson Justice of
Mhm.
prog. Uh, yes, extraordinary. Yeah, stentorian in many ways with that voice, and it's amazing to me working with him. Just see how emotional he was about music, and he would say, "Oh, this is great. This is wonderful. This is great." Unrestrained, nothing like the civil service. It was so different. And then, of course, I spoke to him on the day that he was off to hospital, and he was lamenting the fact that he was very aware that he probably wasn't going to survive. And the last conversation I had would have been about anything but life after death. And he said, "I'm really sorry, but I'm probably not going to see my daughter grow up."
Mhm.
That's not the first time I've been talking to someone who knew they weren't going to make it and talking about not being able to see their kids grow up. The late great actor Ralph Bates, who was a pal of mine, said practically the same thing, and that really pained him. So, okay, jumping ahead to post that situation, she said, "I've heard that Chris wants to get in touch with you," and I said, "Well, there's a very strange thing happened. I was in the car and I got this massive whiff of dope, of
Mhm.
grass, marijuana,
Yeah.
and both my wife and I looked around. The windows were closed and everything. There's no reason why we should have had that." And then it disappeared instantly. And she said, "That's how he gets in touch. That this seems to be some kind of signature."
Mhm.
And I'm quite prepared to believe it.
Yeah.
No reason why she would lie. Um, and in my mind, I'm constantly thinking about Chris, John Wetton, Ian MacDonald, uh, um, just to mention um, a few, pals who've passed on. But my theory, here's my theory. It's going to sound like Monty Python, about the dinosaur theory.
Okay.
But I think we're all in life. We're on this thing. We're kind of captive on the clock, to paraphrase Jody Mitchell. We're on this clock or carousel
Mhm.
that's going round. But at some point, we'll be off it again and be able to look back at all the experiences. And you can well argue that life is a little bit like, before you're in life, you see the film
Yeah.
first of all, and then you enact the part.
Uh-huh.
And that might be the thing that sustains mountaineers who do the most dangerous thing in the world, because they know inwardly that they are going to be okay. They're not going to fall off the mountain. And whatever drives the musician, which will be, at the end of the day, yeah, you're going to get good at this, but you're going to have a lot of grief getting there, but it's going to be worth it. So, there's my little theory. First thing in the morning, that, people say, "Poppycock, absolute rubbish. Hackett knows nothing." But we all hold to our own personal beliefs with this. And I also believe in healing, and the subtext of music, I believe, is healing, not just to re-energize, but to do so much more to people. So that's powerful medicine too.
Yeah.
Um, and I don't know, how do you feel yourself about all of this?
Oh, I believe 100% that we go on to something else. That the
Yes,
existence of the spirit. My father was a practicing medium all his
interesting.
life. He
Yeah,
did say that he said if there was anything, he was going to come back and let me know.
right.
However, when he passed, I never got anything, but then he always used to get my address wrong. So I wonder if he appeared at
Yes.
the bedside of old Margaret next door in Spider
Well,
Egg.
true.
I'm joking a little bit, of course, but yes, I do believe, and I've been
There may have been dreams, of course. Did you dream about your father at all, and was
often.
it anything apropos?
Yes, dreamt about him all the time, still do. You know, after he passed, you could sense he was there around us. I could hear his
Yeah,
voice sometimes, heard
really.
footsteps on the stairs, all sorts of things.
Ah, so
I
he
think,
he did get in touch in a sense, but you're after a full apparition and all that. So
I think
uh,
I think it's just a way of saying, look, we're not gone. You know, we're
we're
just
not
across
gone.
the other room.
No,
Yeah.
exactly. It's
So,
very interesting to me that, when people's beliefs with all of this, and I get the sense of so much going on, but you can't quite put your finger on it because it doesn't communicate in earthly terms.
no.
But you have to go with feelings and with certain things and aspects of healing that
Hmm.
have revealed itself to me, and it's been it's been quite extraordinary. We should have another conversation about this. I
Yes, I've got
suspect.
quite a few stories I could tell you about my father and things like
Yes.
that. You know, as I said, he was a believer, and he used to drag me off to spiritualist churches and places like that when I
Yep.
was younger, and it was a
Yes.
fascinating.
Yeah.
And my going through Catholicism and all sorts of things now, I've arrived at the place where I don't necessarily believe in organized religion, but I believe there's
Yes.
something,
Yes.
you know. But one day
Yeah.
we'll find out, no doubt.
Well, that's it. Yes. One day we'll find out. That's
On
that's
that,
the whole
when we step
that's
off
the
that
whole idea.
carousel.
I've always been interested in it. My father thought that my interest in all of that was how did he put it? He thought it was depressing to be examining death, but it wasn't about death. It wasn't a fascination with death. It was a fascination with the possibility of transformation or relocation
Yeah.
of the spirit and the idea of consciousness. Is it merely local or is it universal? How far can we travel? All of that. I've been writing some new stuff that's got a little bit of this implied, and I guess it's as psychedelic as it comes, but it's drug
Yeah.
free,
Yeah.
and exploratory in the idea, the idea of possibilities and what that's all about. And
I think there's something very English about the ghost story as well, the M.R. James and the churchyards and things like that.
yes, yes.
A romanticism to it, if you like.
Well, there is that as well. Yeah, it's a rich seam of literature,
So,
and not to mention Hammer horror movies and all the rest.
yeah. Anyway, it's fascinating as this conversation. I've got to ask you, get back to Genesis, really.
Sure.
Rolling Stone said the problem with nursery crimes is it's god awful production, it's a murky distant stew that at best bubbles quietly. Is it time for a remix of that album, do you think?
Yes, would I was in the driving seat of that, and I probably would remix it, but it's probably more likely that I'll do a revisit at some point with certain pieces that I know worked wonderfully in the rehearsal room and didn't always communicate itself onto vinyl. The best of it is not on vinyl, but I think that many of the ideas were very very good. Now some of those tunes I've redone. I've done them live.
Yeah, you have.
Some of them I've revisited, sometimes with an orchestra, lots of different versions of these things. So yes, I mean I grant you that the production wasn't always crystal clear. It was pretty murky, sometimes deliberately so, because I think that impressionistic aspect of Genesis, perhaps the overuse of the rotary cabinet, the Leslie
Hmm.
guitars were put through Leslie cabinets, organs were put through it, sometimes mellotron was put through it. So this idea of the swirly sound that was part and parcel of it. But what you can't take away from Genesis is the idea of all those massed 12 strings playing together where you weren't sure what you were listening to. Are you listening to guitars? Are you listening to uh, a harpsichord quartet or trio? It's all of that, and Genesis was all about blurring the distinctions between instruments anyway, so you couldn't always detect the sound source it was part of our appeal. I think it was part of the appeal of King Crimson. I think there was something about it. I know that the Beach Boys were heading towards that, the idea of combining things so that they became one. Again, back to Beatles as well, that idea of guitars becoming pianos and pianos becoming guitars with use of vari speed, and that George Martin approach that you'd hear on not just on Beatles, but you'd also hear it. I'm thinking Hard Day's Night, the opening chord, all of that stuff, the legend that accompanies that. But then the Billy J. Crane stuff, and listening to, the backing tracks and thinking, that sounds really good, and no one's really touched upon that since. So why not? It gives a sweetness to a ballad and an extra kind of colouring that's that's quite lovely. So the creation of new instruments.
Yeah.
And why shouldn't that, or new sounds that sound like new instruments, and you be pondering, thinking, what's going on here?
Yeah.
But that's all lovely and ought to be investigated more in the future. I'll just stab myself in the wrist and remember to do that when I'm trying too hard to be a guitar hero, and think to myself, well, actually, the beauty of the approach of someone like my predecessor in Genesis, Anthony Phillips, was the fact that he was prepared to let the music speak and not always go for the Olympics in the other sense of the word. But there we are, with two guitarists. We've occasionally worked together on little things, but I suspect our approaches are slightly different. I remember this about Genesis, seeing them live first time and thinking they ambled on, and they did this little folk thing at the beginning, and I thought, this sounds all very pretty, but it's not the way to grab the audience. They're going to start wandering off, and sure enough, they did. So I think the thing about a rock audience is you have to sometimes play to the lowest common denominator. So you're often going for something at the beginning, hit them over the head with something first of all, pin them to the back wall, and then perhaps you've got them for the rest of the gig, because they're waiting for that moment again, even if it never comes. So I think that's the idea of best foot forward, unless you happen to be doing an acoustic concert, and I've often done that, and you've got to suffer the slings and arrows accordingly. It requires the complicit audience. They got to be completely quiet in order to hear this stuff. So I'm not completely unsubtle.
Yeah. But Nursery Cryme, the guitar sound on Nursery Cryme, wasn't that a big influence on Queen?
Well, according to Brian May, he said that my guitar playing on Musical Box, the first track on the first Genesis album I played on, he said was a big influence on him. Now, there are a number of guitar solos on that track. I was given a lot of space on it. There's a little tinkly one, then there's a heavy one, and then there's a harmony one at the end. Whether specifically he was thinking of the one at the end that I recorded as a 3-part harmony. Unfortunately, you can only hear it as a 2-part. In those days, we were doing mixes at God knows what time in the morning and trying to do it all in one go, as young bands do. The sort of going for it type mix. But I'm thrilled that was an influence on him, because his work is absolutely stellar. It's always very neat, isn't it? It's always, you get the feeling that there's nothing left to chance with his solos. Although when we did record together on something, there was a version of a thing called Cassandra. He did an absolutely spontaneous solo on that, and it's really very, very good. It's him. You hear it. It's perhaps it's a little more bluesy and rough and ready than the absolutely pristine work that accompanies all of Queen's guitar stuff and vocals. That it's all very, very through composed, I think, is a word that probably is not often used with any rock band, but I would say that was what distinguished Queen musically, because they were outstanding. I remember even hearing their demos before they had a record deal. I heard them at Charisma Record Company offices,
Right.
and I remember saying to Tony Stratton Smith, "I think you should sign these guys." And for one reason or another, that didn't happen. But their demos were stunning, and perhaps that became. There's no reason why those things shouldn't have been just released in that form. You know, it was stunningly good. And the thing I noticed immediately was the guitar work. I thought, oh, this guy's good. There's no doubt about that. So we got to work together, Brian and I, on a couple of different projects over the years, and he's a very sweet man. And I've got one of his guitars, funnily enough, the design that he came up with, that famous guitar that he and his father made out of a piece of spare fireplace or something. And it's very idiosyncratic. As soon as you play it, it sounds like Brian. But it's got this sort of upper harmonic facility when you put the neck pickup out of phase with the other two, and so you get this kind of onboard wah-wah sound that is quite thrilling. It has to be said. You know, it's almost like you're operating in another octave, and you need some distortion with it and what have you. But he's a great player. I say I'm waxing eloquent about the abilities of friend Brian.
Well, I'm sure he'll appreciate it. How are you doing for time, Steve? Do you want to?
I'm okay for time. All I've got to do is to. I've got people arriving at about 11 o'clock. My time's okay. I'm probably okay for about another 5 minutes or so. Is that all right for you?
Yeah.
I've got to sort myself out before work starts up here today. I'm mixing an album. We're mixing it in surround. Roger King's doing a wonderful job on it. It's another new project. It'll be out.
Is that another cat out of the bag then, is it?
Another cat out of the bag, yeah. And my publicist Sharon will be saying, "You shouldn't be talking about that now. You shouldn't be talking about Foxtrot." So we never said that. No.
Okay.
No, I'm not working on anything. No, it's all. Sorry, why do you want to join the Secret Service anyway?
Yeah. I've got a strange question for you, actually. Interesting. Ian Anderson, speaking to the Rock History channel, highlighted some pretty awful experiences he's had with fans over the years. In fact, he recounts one incident where he had a pint glass full of pee or urine tipped over his head just before he went on stage. I suppose you kind of know where this question is going. Have you had any dreadful experiences with fans over the years?
There's been the odd thing. Usually, early days. I remember the very early days of a band I was in for a short while before Genesis, doing a live gig, and it was at a shotgun wedding somewhere near Edgware Road. It was a place called the Four Feathers Club, I think, and the band were the wrong band. They really wanted someone to do stuff like The Last Waltz and Engelbert Humperdinck and Frank Sinatra and all the rest, and instead of which Canterbury Glass band at the time, some of what they did was original, some of it was pop, some of it was rock, some of it was blues, and I used to get up and play the odd solo with them, sometimes on guitar, because I wasn't a full member of the band, but they'd call me in as a sort of hitman to wake things up a little bit. So I'd play harmonica and all the rest. And now at some point, the audience made it known to the band that they weren't happy with them. And the band, I was off stage at this point, watching this going on. I remember the band deciding to have this real freak out live and going to feedback and talk about confrontation. And I remember the audience, all the guests, rushed the stage and started attacking the band, pulling amps, pulling leads out of amps and knocking things over and all the rest. And it turned into a bit of a fist fight, and the police were called. And I was just standing on the side watching this going on. I should have hightailed it, but I was watching this with a sense of terrible fascination,
Yeah, like a
thinking that
healing
at any
comedy.
point, I said, "Are you one of them?" And luckily, no one did. Oh, nothing to do with me. No, no, no. Yeah, I'm just a reporter from the Daily What's It. Yes,
Exactly.
watching this stuff going. Yeah, so there have been a few hairy moments. So um, it's not all hero worship. I can assure you.
I can imagine. I can imagine. One more question for you, and that
Yeah.
is Frank Zappa said that all the good music has already been written by people with wigs and stuff. Do you think there will come a time when there'll be nothing original to say in music?
Um, well, if I'm depressed, I'll say, music isn't doing anything surprising at a certain point. And then other times, if I've just done something that I happen to be in love with, I'll be thinking, conversely, music is always doing something surprising. So it all depends on your mood on the day and whether you want to be quoted or not. I would say there are times when I'll come up against a writer's block, and then another time there'll be a breakthrough, and I'll be thinking, no, all those guys in wigs did wonderful stuff,
Hmm.
certainly. But um, beyond that, beyond Bach, there has to be. At one point I was going to do an album called uh, Bach, Blues and Beyond. And I still haven't gotten around to that because I doubt that any record company say, "No, I'm sorry, we can't pigeonhole this. We're not going to release it. You'll have to do it yourself for free." And maybe it'll be a compilation, and I'll do that. But it's all of those things I'm prepared to entertain: Baroque music, blues music, and beyond, and the fusion of the two, which is what we have today with Bach as the father of Western music as we know it. And there was some interesting stuff going on before Bach, but in the main, he's head and shoulders, and then you've got all the other incredible keyboard players that followed. They used to teach, and perhaps they still do. I've never learned formally, but the idea of teaching keyboard, piano, and violin as the twin sort of bastions of composition. Nothing wrong with that, except that I never subscribed to that. For me, guitar was always a symbol of freedom, and so I accepted those chains willingly. I willingly thought, yes, I have to pay homage. So at least one of my albums featured 6 pieces of Bach, and I accepted the yoke and the challenge voluntarily because I loved the music, the beauty of it. But you do have to be good to do that stuff. There's no doubt about it. It's a lifelong commitment. Even if you're lousy at it, it's still a lifelong commitment. It's not forgiving stuff. You're not doing the easy thing.
Yeah, well, and it's been an absolute
Yeah.
pleasure speaking with you. I'll just plug this again. This is Steve Hackett, Foxtrot at 50, Hackett Highlights, live in Brighton, out
Yes.
tomorrow.
Brilliant.
And the purchasing link is just below this video.
Well, it's
And
lovely talking to you again, Barry. I have to go and do my other thing, my other life now. So back
well,
to the future, as they say.
absolutely, you have a wonderful day. Anyway, thank you so much for
Thank you.
taking time to.
Great talking, as ever. Thank you. All
All
the
the best.
best.
Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye bye.